So I'm associate professor at the University Autònoma of Barcelona. The paper is Judith Butler's Principles and All-Three Texts, some proposals to combine postfeminism and Assyriology. Sarah Milich Nelson, in the introduction to her Gender in Archaeology, published 1997, stated that a gendered archaeology is an improved archaeology. Echoing her proposal, then, I hold that a gendered Assyriology is an improved Assyriology. But engendering Assyriology could be done following several proposals, sometimes contradictory proposals. Today in this communication, I will share with you one of the possible paths we can use to engender Assyriology, postfeminism through Judith Butler's Principles. At this point, however, I must admit that what I propose is not unproblematic, as applying contemporary theoretical proposals and categories of analysis to the study of the past is controversial. Indeed, we should act carefully when doing it, as there is the danger of recreating the past just as we understand our present, instead of gaining a better understanding of the past itself. Despite that, it's also obvious that we need to apply terms and categories understandable for us all. In other words, I sustain that we cannot avoid applying modern categories of analysis. However, we should do it explicitly and taking some precautions. Having these premises in mind, what I propose here is to reflect on how Judith Butler's proposals can inspire us to study workforce as shown in Ur3 administrative texts, so texts from the end of the 3rd millennium from southern Mesopotamia. Trying then to find balance between primary sources and secondary literature. Today, then, I will present some theoretical points, illustrated with a selection of excerpts from Butler's essays and 2 or 3 administrative texts that I propose to interpret in the light of these excerpts. As main issue of this communication is the theoretical approach on Ur3 administrative texts, and they are highly standardized, I decided to show you only 2 of these representative texts. Despite that, the sample I used initially to bring up these proposals is a selection of 100 representative texts, in turn selected from a sample of almost 2,000 texts. Before presenting these excerpts and the theoretical proposals, I will begin with a brief presentation of Judith Butler's work and her influence in the study of antiquity. Judith Butler is a philosopher now at the University of California, Berkeley, and she received her PhD on philosophy from Yale University in 1984 on the French reception of Hegel. And she's the author of many books on gender theory. But I want to highlight here 2 of them. One is Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, published in 1990. This text was not her first book, but the book that made she became famous, and is considered as one of the foundational texts, if not the foundational text, of queer studies. The second book I want to highlight is Undoing Gender, published 2004, a compilation of some of her essays on gender and sexuality previously published between 1999 and 2004. Some of the excerpts I will quote below have been picked from this collection of essays. Why decided then to focus today only on Butler's proposals and not on other authors or on postfeminism in a broad sense? I took this decision because among all postfeminist thinkers, she's one, or perhaps the only one, known by those without a particular interest in postfeminism. Indeed, her works have been really influential in the last decades in several arenas of the humanities. A good example is the special issue of the International Journal of Sexuality and Gender Studies, published in 2001, with the following title: Butler Matters, Judith Butler's Impact on Feminist and Queer Studies Since Gender Trouble. Especially interesting for us is one of the papers by Elizabeth Perry and Rosemary Joyce that is entitled Interdisciplinary Applications, Providing a Past for Bodies That Matter, Judith Butler's Impact on the Archaeology of Gender. One of the authors of the paper, Rosemary Joyce, worked herself from the beginning of the 90s applying Butler's approaches to interpretation in archaeology, especially to Mesoamerican archaeology. Moving now to the study of the ancient Near East, in recent years appears some research applying Butler's proposals explicitly or implicitly. One example is the still recent volume edited by Diane Bolger in 2008, Gender Through Time in the Ancient Near East. In the introduction, Bolger summarizes some common points of several contributions to the volume. Two of these points allude to, first, gender as dynamic rather than static, and therefore subject to considerable variation through time and space. And second, and I quote, the recognition that gender is an important aspect of social identity which interfaces with other factors such as age, rank, class, and ethnicity. We will see in a couple of minutes that these ideas are directly linked to some Butler's proposals, despite here it's not explicit. More explicit, however, is the recent paper by Jonathan Stockel on gender ambiguity in ancient Near Eastern prophecy, published 2013. First part of the article uses some of Butler's works to place his theoretical approach, with a special emphasis on gender as performance, and biological sex as socially constructed and not as essential and natural. After this short presentation and state of research, now we will highlight some ideas or aspects proposed or taken from Butler and that have been useful for me to approach the UR3 administrative text with a new prism. Some issues that we develop in this communication can be summarized as follows. First, Butler's proposals are proposals against essentialism. Indeed, she defends that sex and sexuality are as socially constructed as gender is. In other words, the most famous Butler proposal, usually summarized as gender as performance. And if we accept that gender and sex are constructed and not natural, then we do not have to look for one fixed identity, but for several fluid and constantly changing gender and sexual identities. Second, and going another step further, not only identities are performative, but language is performative too, and not only descriptive. Third, I would like to draw attention on how Butler, among others, defines kinship, displacing biological and sexual ties from the core of the concept. After having a look on proposals I summarized in this short list, probably you realize that some of them are not fully original by Butler, if fully original proposals and ideas exist. In them you can recognize some echoes from 20th century French philosophers like Derrida or Foucault, and even some ideas starting from Hegel's proposals, no more than 200 years old. But as I discovered them from Butler, and I consider that her approach is always adding something else to previous approaches, especially in what concerns gender, I deal with them as made in Butler, or at least for me as inspired by Butler. Let's continue now quoting directly some excerpts of her works. First, on gender as performance, I quote here one of the first paragraphs of her Introduction to Undoing Gender, the collection of essays published 2004. As the proposal was made by Butler first time in Gender Trouble, so in 1990, having a look on this introduction written some years after that seems interesting to me as she reformulates her proposal, taking into account the numerous reactions and critiques received. Let's read then the quotation you have here in the slide. I will highlight a couple of sentences. So one that says that if gender is a kind of doing, an incessant activity performed, so it's this idea of something that is constantly being built, it is a practice of improvisation within an ascent of constraint, something that is not totally free, okay? As this gender as performance is her most well-known proposal, it's one of those discussed as applicable to archaeology by Rosemary Joyce, one of the scholars I quoted above. Let's see then her proposal in a recent joint publication with Teresa Bolger, and I will read it complete. For performative identities are reinforced throughout performances in everyday life, and thus, from an archaeological point of view, the question isn't whether we can see evidence of them, it is how we have avoided seeing them. At this point then, here I do not propose applying the principle of gender as performance to interpret workforce in UR3 administrative texts directly, but as a principle that alerts us about the idea of not taking something for granted, even sex. To this respect then, for me Butler is inspiring. In addition, reading her writings gives me some clues to deconstruct some interpretations repeated uncritically in secondary literature dealing with UR3 administrative texts. In this case, then, I use Butler mainly to deconstruct, not to construct a new interpretation, so in an attempt to avoid applying directly contemporary patterns to the past. I find all these reflections particularly important when dealing not only with Urtri texts, but with gender in antiquity in a broad sense, as there is a trend to apply our own preconceptions, a trend more prevalent in gender than in other issues. As Joan Guerro, one of the pioneers of engendering archaeology, noticed, and I quote, "Possibly because each of us has a gender, at least one gender, we assume that gender categories are obvious, that what follows from gender categories is straightforward and unproblematic, and that we understand how gender works in social and economic life. In contrast to the obviously unfamiliar aspects of prehistory, such as technologies for bronze casting or Pleistocene weather patterns, things that we have never experienced in our own lifetimes, there is something reassuring about gender systems that lies them, ancient women and men, more or less straightforwardly to us, modern inhabitants of Western industrial societies." Let's see then the example of one Urtri text where we show how gender and age interact, so how gender identity is not fixed but constantly changing. So in the text they show here in the slide, you have several working categories, some of them translated here as female workers, others as old male workers or all male female workers, and others are children, so ambiguous from the point of view of sex or gender. So I mean in this case that if we are looking for women workers, we are in trouble. So we have women workers just as female workers, but we also have this category of age interacting in some cases, and last we have the category of children without information about gender. So reading Butler when analyzing this kind of texts comes to mind that putting research questions like how were women in 3rd millennium Mesopotamia, or even how women's work was on how were female workers is slippery. In other words, identity of these women or female workers in text is performative and then variable. An example could be the one shown here on how age affects the construction of gender identity, and also on how, at some moments, as is the case for children, gender is more explicitly being laden, and perhaps for this reason, in some texts, is not specified. Moving now to the second point, not only identities are performative, but language is performative too, and not only descriptive. It is difficult to choose only one short excerpt to exemplify this statement, as it's one of those developed extensively and with a certain degree of complexity by Butler. But despite that, I will quote two of these excerpts. In this first one, is highlighted that language is already going on, that is already saturated with norms. Here we find again this idea of the norms that are present when we perform our identities. And this second excerpt, where what is highlighted is that spoken words are strangely bodily offerings. This second quotation seems particularly interesting for me as it's linking language and bodies, something basic if we are interested in how language interacts with gender. I propose to consider these approaches, especially to reflect on one issue: the potential neutrality of Sumerian language as regards grammatical gender. From my point of view, this statement takes on a particular meaning when considered through the prism of Butler's proposal. Let's consider it in the text chosen as example. The text we can see here in the slide. Here the words Ugula and Ushber, the Sumerian words, are neutral as regards grammatical gender. If we concentrate on Ugula, so the word translated as supervisor or something like that, to specify if people alluded by this job category were males or females, we need a proper name, despite in Sumerian their identification is often a problematic issue. Another possibility is adding substantives or determinatives like male or female. In addition, Jonathan Stockel recently reflected on our impossibility to confirm if these determinatives for male or female, when present, refer to gender or to biological sex, which do not necessarily correspond to each other. At this point then, I propose to consider the presence of these determinatives as significant as their absence. Therefore, I prefer translating for men or for women, putting both to make explicit this ambiguity or neutrality, considering then that language is performative and not only descriptive. Third, finally, moving now to the last point, I would like to draw attention on how Butler, among others, defines kinship, displacing biological and sexual ties from the core of the concept. And here we have a couple of quotations again. In this first one, it's highlighted that the relationships of kinship cross the boundaries between community and family. So, sustaining these webs of relationship, they constitute a breakdown of traditional kinship that displaces the presumption that biological and sexual relations structure kinship centrally. And still another quotation for other of these essays on doing gender that is trying to define how can be kinship defined. Kinship as a set of practices that institutes relationships of various kinds, which negotiate the reproduction of life and the demands of death. So kinship is neither a fully autonomous sphere proclaimed to be distinct from community or friendship. Moving now to the all three administrative texts again, I think that applying this idea of kinship following Butler would be more enlightening than applying kinship or family based on biological and sexual ties as categories of analysis. I propose then considering the extended family, understanding this extended family as including not only relatives outside the nuclear family, but also big organizations like temples and palaces. Additionally, linked to Butler's definitions of kinship appear other useful concepts like solidarity networks or homosexuality, understanding homosexuality as same-sex relationships that are not of a romantic or sexual nature. So if we have a look on this text, that is the first text I showed you before, Dumu, the Sumerian word Dumu, in this kind of text is sometimes translated as offspring, so sons or daughters of the female workers of the first lines. From my point of view, this information is not the most relevant one, and we have no evidences to defend this possibility. In other words, I hold that sexual and biological ties are not as relevant to characterize this workforce. Moreover, the above-mentioned solidarity networks or homosexuality would be more influential to define collectives of work, especially solidarity networks in this case. So for all this, I prefer the translation children and not offspring in texts like this one. To conclude, I want to focus on two metaphors of vision. They have been used to explain how applying gender studies to our research serves in what regards the choice of topics of study, the form of research questions and the answers we get. Sandra Bem in 1993 presented the so-called lenses of gender, as lenses that transform what we see when we look through. Some years later, Sarah Nelson in 1997 presented gender studies as a prism that reveals colors that were not visible before. For me, Judith Butler's proposals act in this direction when applied to all three administrative texts. They are like the prism that allows me to see a variety of colors that were previously invisible. Thank you for your attention.